The crackling voice over the radio cut through the November heat like a blade through butter. "Base, this is Major Meredith. Repeat. We need immediate reinforcement. These massive birds are destroying everything in sight." I adjusted my headset and leaned closer to the transmitter, certain I'd misheard. It was 1932, and I was barely 19, manning the radio at Campion Military Base in Western Australia. The static cleared just enough for me to catch the Major's next transmission. "I'm telling you, they're organized. Moving in formations like nothing I've seen outside of the trenches." The base commander, Colonel Peterson, grabbed the handset from my station. His weathered face, marked by years of desert campaigns and the Great War, carried the kind of authority that made even seasoned sergeants straighten their spines. But as Major Meredith's report continued, I watched that confidence drain away like water in the red dirt. "Sir, with respect, did you say birds?" Peterson's voice carried a note I'd never heard before, the kind of uncertainty that makes a young radio operator's stomach clench. "Emus, Colonel. Thousands of them. Maybe tens of thousands. They've obliterated 3 farms in 2 days, and they're moving south toward the wheat belt like an invading army." The static couldn't mask the exhaustion in Meredith's voice. "The Lewis guns might as well be pea shooters, these birds. Christ, they're not acting like any wildlife I've encountered." Peterson set the handset down with deliberate care, the kind of movement that precedes either violence or very bad news. He turned to me, his gray eyes holding the weight of a decision that would later become the stuff of barroom jokes and newspaper headlines around the world. "Private Morrison, grab your kit. You're being reassigned to Operation Desert Pest." He paused, seeming to taste the absurdity of the words. "Your job is to document everything. And I mean everything. If this goes sideways, Command will want to know exactly how we managed to—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Just make sure you get it all down." That's how I found myself bouncing along a dusty track in a military truck the next morning, headed toward Chandler, with Major Meredith and 2 other soldiers. Each of us was equipped with Lewis guns and enough ammunition to level a small town. The countryside rolled past in waves of golden grass and scattered scrub, looking peaceful as a church service. Nothing in that serene landscape suggested we were driving toward what would become one of the most embarrassing military operations in Australian history. Major Meredith rode in the passenger seat, a compact man with the kind of mustache that belonged in recruitment posters. He'd seen action in France, had the medals to prove it, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd stared down German machine guns and lived to tell about it. But as we approached the reported Emu positions, I noticed his fingers drumming against his knee, a nervous habit that seemed at odds with his reputation. "There," he said, pointing toward a ridge about half a mile ahead. "That's where the farmer reported them yesterday." At first, I saw nothing but the usual scrubland. Then the landscape seemed to shift, like when you're staring at one of those optical illusions, and suddenly the hidden image jumps out at you. What I'd taken for scattered bushes and shadows resolved into something that made my breath catch in my throat. Emus, hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. They moved across the terrain with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Each bird stood nearly 6 feet tall, their long necks swiveling with an alertness that reminded me uncomfortably of sentries. But it wasn't their size that made my hands shake as I reached for my notebook, it was their behavior. They weren't just wandering aimlessly like you'd expect from a flock of birds. They moved in groups, with clear patterns and what looked disturbingly like coordination. Scouts ranged out ahead of the main body, while others seemed to be guarding the flanks. As our truck approached, I watched waves of communication ripple through their ranks, heads turning, bodies shifting, the entire mass of birds responding to our presence with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. "Jesus," muttered Sergeant Hayes from beside me, He was a career soldier, 20 years in the service, and I'd never heard his voice crack before. Look at the size of them. Major Meredith raised his binoculars. The reports were accurate. They're stripping everything in their path. He was right. The landscape behind the emu horde looked like it had been hit by locusts. Bare earth stretched for miles, marked by the distinctive three-toed prints that would become as familiar to me as my own handwriting over the next few weeks. The truck rolled to a stop about 300 yards from the nearest birds. This close, I could see individual emus clearly, their dark, intelligent eyes, the way they tilted their heads to study us with what looked uncomfortably like calculation. A few of the larger birds, probably males, took several steps toward us, their necks stretched high in what might have been curiosity or challenge. "Right then," Major Meredith said, climbing down from the truck, with the matter-of-fact tone of a man heading off to a routine patrol. According to the farmers, they typically scatter when confronted. Standard dispersal tactics should work. We'll set up the Lewis guns in a crossfire pattern, wait for them to bunch up, then open fire. Should be wrapped up by lunch. I followed the soldiers as they unloaded the weapons, my notebook clutched in sweaty hands. The sun was climbing toward its merciless noon position, and the heat was already making my uniform stick to my back. But the temperature wasn't what made me uncomfortable as I watched the emus watching us. Because they were definitely watching us. As the soldiers set up their positions, I noticed how the birds' formations shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. Groups that had been clustered together began to spread out. The scouts I'd noticed earlier pulled back toward the main body, while others moved to positions that looked suspiciously like they were designed to provide multiple escape routes. "Sir," I called to Major Meredith, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are they supposed to be doing that?" He followed my gaze and his face went very still. The emus weren't just standing around anymore. They were definitely repositioning, flowing like water around obstacles, maintaining spacing that would make retreat easier, while keeping their numbers concentrated enough to continue their systematic destruction of the landscape. "Probably just coincidence," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Animals react to perceived threats, nothing more than that." The first engagement began at 11:47 a.m. on November 13, 1932. I know the exact time because I was documenting everything, just as Colonel Peterson had ordered. What I documented was the moment when 3 seasoned military men discovered that the enemy they faced was unlike anything in their training manuals. Major Meredith gave the signal to open fire. The Lewis guns erupted in a deafening chatter that should have cut through the emu ranks like scythes through wheat. For a moment, it seemed to work exactly as planned. The birds in the direct line of fire scattered, their harsh cries mixing with the sound of gunfire to create a cacophony that could probably be heard for miles. But then, everything went wrong at once. The Lewis guns, reliable weapons that had served faithfully through the horrors of trench warfare, began to jam. Not one, not two, but all 3 weapons seized up within minutes of the opening barrage. Sergeant Hayes cursed with a creativity that would have impressed a dock worker as he tried to clear the breach on his gun, while Private Collins struggled with a bolt that had somehow become completely stuck. "What the hell?" Major Meredith's voice cracked as he wrestled with his own weapon. "These guns were serviced yesterday, but the mechanical failures were only the beginning of our problems." As the gunfire sputtered to a halt, I watched the emu response with growing horror. They weren't just running blindly. The birds had scattered in what looked like predetermined patterns, breaking into smaller groups that moved with purpose and coordination. Some headed east, others west, but they maintained visual contact with each other through a system of calls and signals that spoke to a level of organization I'd never seen in wild animals. Worse still, as I tracked their movement through my binoculars, I realized that the groups weren't actually retreating. They were repositioning, flowing around our flanks in a maneuver that would have been impressive if executed by trained cavalry. "Sir," I called out, my voice nearly lost in the confusion of jamming weapons and angry birds. "They're surrounding us." Major Meredith looked up from his Lewis gun, his face flushed with heat and frustration. He followed my pointing finger and I watched his expression shift from annoyance to something approaching disbelief. The emus had indeed surrounded us. Not closely. They maintained a respectful distance from our weapons, but they'd formed a loose circle that encompassed our position from multiple angles. Individual birds kept appearing and disappearing behind scrub and ridgelines, making it impossible to get an accurate count of their numbers or predict their next move. "This is not possible," Sergeant Hayes muttered, finally clearing his weapon's breech. "They're just birds, they don't use tactics." But tactics were exactly what we were seeing. As Hayes raised his Lewis gun for another attempt, the emus seemed to sense the threat. Without any visible signal that I could detect, the entire visible flock began to move. Not fleeing, moving. They flowed across the landscape like schools of fish, individual groups merging and splitting in patterns that kept our gunners from getting clear shots while maintaining their encirclement. The second barrage lasted exactly 37 seconds before the guns jammed again. This time the stoppages seemed to occur simultaneously, as if the weapons had been coordinated in their failure. Private Collins threw his helmet on the ground in frustration, while Major Meredith stared at his Lewis gun with the expression of a man whose fundamental understanding of the world had just been called into question. "The dust," he said finally, though his voice carried no conviction. "It's the dust getting in the mechanisms." But I was watching the emus, and dust wasn't our biggest problem. During the brief firefight, I'd seen at least 3 birds go down. In any normal situation, that should have sent the rest of the flock into panicked flight. Instead, the emus had simply adjusted their formations around the casualties and continued their systematic movement. The fallen birds were quickly surrounded by their companions, who formed defensive circles while maintaining their overall tactical positions. They were protecting their wounded, and they were learning. As the afternoon wore on, our situation went from embarrassing to genuinely concerning. Every attempt to restart our attack was met with mechanical failures that seemed to occur at precisely the worst possible moments. The Lewis guns, designed to function in the hell of the Western Front, couldn't seem to handle a few Australian birds and some red dust. But it was the emus' behavior that truly unnerved me. They'd settled into what could only be described as a siege mentality, maintaining their loose encirclement, while small groups rotated through positions that kept us under constant observation. Individual birds would approach within rifle range, study our positions with obvious intelligence, then withdraw to report back to the larger groups. "It's like their Vedi-Mentar reconnaissance units," I wrote in my notebook, then immediately crossed it out. Such observations would make us all look insane in the official reports. Major Meredith finally called for withdrawal, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. We'd expended nearly all our ammunition, taken out fewer than a dozen birds, and been thoroughly outmaneuvered by what was supposed to be a routine pest control operation. As we packed up our equipment, I noticed the emus beginning to move again. They flowed back toward their original path of destruction, resuming their systematic devastation of the landscape with what looked disturbingly like satisfaction. Several of the larger birds actually seemed to watch our retreat, their heads turning to track our truck as we bumped and rattled back toward the main road. "Tomorrow," Major Meredith said, his voice tight with the kind of determination that usually preceded either heroic victories or spectacular disasters. "Tomorrow, we'll try a different approach." But as I looked back through the truck's rear window, watching the emus settle back into their destructive routine, I had a sinking feeling that tomorrow would bring more of the same. The birds had adapted to our tactics faster than we'd adapted to theirs. They'd learned from our attack, demonstrated coordination that shouldn't have been possible, and shown a level of intelligence that made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The war was just beginning, and we were already losing. The morning of our 3rd day brought an ominous change in the emus' behavior. Where before they had been reactive, defensive, now there was something purposeful in their movements that made the hair on my neck stand up. I had positioned myself on a low ridge with my field glasses, documenting what I'd started to think of as their tactical formations, when I realized they weren't just feeding or moving randomly anymore. They were converging. From 3 different directions, separate flocks were flowing together like tributaries joining a river. The sound reached us first, a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. Hundreds of those deep, booming calls mixing into something that felt less like bird noise and more like a war drum. Major Meredith lowered his own glasses, his face pale beneath the red dust and sweat. "Christ," he muttered, "there must be 2,000 of them." Through my lenses, I watched the great mass of birds organize itself with military precision that would have impressed the instructors at Sandhurst. The larger males took positions at the front and flanks, while the females and younger birds formed the dense center. They weren't just gathering, they were preparing for something. And as that realization hit me, I saw the direction they were facing, straight toward us. "Sir," I called down to where the men were setting up the Lewis guns, "Sir, I think we need to consider repositioning." But Major Meredith was already caught up in the tactical challenge, studying the approaching formation like it was a Prussian cavalry charge instead of a flock of birds. "No," he said, his voice taking on that tone of grim determination I'd learned to fear. "This is our chance. They've concentrated their forces. If we can break their formation, scatter them properly this time." I wanted to argue, wanted to point out that everything we'd tried had failed, that these birds had consistently outmaneuvered us, but military training runs deep, and Major Meredith outranked my growing certainty that we were making a terrible mistake. The attack began differently this time. Instead of the chaotic rush we'd seen before, the emus advanced in waves. The first line moved forward at a steady trot, maintaining their spacing like infantry advancing under fire. Behind them, successive waves followed at precise intervals. It was coordinated movement on a scale that shouldn't have been possible for wild animals. Our first volley caught them at about 200 yards. The Lewis guns chattered their familiar rhythm, and I saw birds fall in the front rank. But instead of scattering, the formation simply flowed around the casualties. The second wave stepped over the fallen, maintaining speed and direction. The third wave continued the advance without even slowing down. "They're not breaking!" Someone shouted over the gunfire, panic creeping into his voice. That's when I noticed the flanking movements. While our attention was focused on the main advance, groups of emus had been working their way around our position. These weren't random movements, these were coordinated maneuvers designed to envelope our small force. The birds on our left flank were moving through a shallow creek bed that provided them perfect cover, while the right flank group was using a series of low bushes to mask their approach. "Sir," I called down, "we've got movement on both flanks." But it was too late. The Lewis gun on our right chose that moment to jam, not with the gradual slowing we'd experienced before, but with a sudden, complete seizure that left the gunner frantically trying to clear the mechanism, while emus poured out of the scrub not 50 yards away. The birds that emerged weren't running blindly, they advanced with purpose, their heads low, their powerful legs driving them forward in a coordinated charge that would have done credit to the Light Brigade. What happened next haunts me still. The emus didn't just attack, they executed what could only be described as a tactical maneuver. The front ranks engaged our position directly, keeping us pinned and focused forward, while the flanking groups swept around behind us. Within minutes we found ourselves surrounded by a living wall of feathers, beaks, and those terrible, intelligent eyes. I've been in combat, faced men with rifles and artillery, felt the ground shake under bombardment, watched good soldiers break, but I'd never been surrounded by 2,000 emus, and never by a force that seemed to understand what it was doing. The sound alone was overwhelming, the booming calls and the thunder of thousands of feet. Major Meredith was shouting orders, but his voice was lost in the chaos. The remaining Lewis gun was still firing, but the gunner was shooting at individual targets in a mass too large and too close for the weapon to be effective. Men were grabbing rifles, pistols, anything they could find, but we were infantry soldiers trained for human warfare, not whatever this was. That's when I saw our supply truck. I'd positioned it about 100 yards behind our firing line, close enough to provide ammunition but far enough back to be out of immediate danger. Or so we'd thought. Now it represented our only possible escape route, and the gap between us and it was rapidly filling with very large, very angry birds. "The truck!" I shouted, grabbing Major Meredith's arm. "We need to reach the truck." He looked where I was pointing, and I saw him make the calculation. The distance, the terrain, the odds of making it through that mass of emus. His face went white, but he nodded. "Fall back," he bellowed, "back to the truck, now." What followed was the most terrifying 100 yards of my life. We moved as a group, backing toward the truck while trying to maintain some semblance of military order. But the emus pressed us hard, flowing around our flanks, cutting off escape routes, forcing us into an increasingly tight formation. They weren't merely pursuing, they were herding us, moving us like sheep. I stumbled over something and went down hard, my rifle spinning away into the dust. Before I could get up, I found myself staring at a wall of emu legs, each one thick as a fence post and ending in claws capable of causing serious injury. The birds towered over me, their heads weaving back and forth as they studied this strange creature who'd fallen among them. For a moment that seemed to last forever, we regarded each other, predator and prey, though I wasn't entirely certain which was which. The nearest emu cocked its head, fixing me with one dark, intelligent eye. In that gaze I saw something that chilled me more than fear or anger would have. I saw calculation, assessment, decision. Then hands grabbed me under the arms, hauling me backward toward the truck. Morrison and another soldier had broken from the group to pull me clear, firing their rifles one-handed to keep the birds at bay. We scrambled into the truck bed just as the emu line surged forward, the birds flowing around the vehicle like water around a stone. But they didn't attack the truck immediately. Instead, they surrounded it, forming concentric circles that stretched out as far as I could see. Thousands of birds, standing in rough formation, watching us with those unnerving dark eyes, waiting. "Start the engine!" Major Meredith shouted at Morrison, who was frantically working the ignition. The motor turned over once, twice, then caught, with a reluctant roar. But as we began to move, the emus moved with us, maintaining their formation while allowing us to proceed at barely walking pace. It was an escort, a controlled withdrawal. They were letting us leave, but on their terms, at their speed, in the direction they chose. For 5 miles we crawled across the landscape surrounded by that living wall of birds, never allowed to go faster than they permitted, never allowed to deviate from the path they approved. Only when we reached the main road did they stop. The formation halted as precisely as it had moved, and we continued forward alone. When I looked back, I saw them watching our retreat, not with the random attention of animals, but with the focused observation of commanders studying a defeated enemy. Back at camp, the debriefing was a disaster. Major Meredith tried to present the engagement as a tactical withdrawal, but everyone could see the truth in his shaking hands and haunted eyes. We'd been routed by birds, driven from the field by creatures that shouldn't have possessed the intelligence or organization to coordinate such an operation. The press got hold of it within days. Somehow, word of our defeat had reached Perth, then Sydney, then the world. Headlines mocked us. Australian Army retreats from emus, military might defeated by feathers, the great emu victory. Editorial cartoons showed soldiers fleeing from cartoon birds, and comedy sketches on the radio portrayed us as bumbling incompetents. Major Meredith was recalled to headquarters for consultation. The operation was quietly suspended, officially due to mechanical difficulties and ammunition shortages. No mention was made of the tactical sophistication we'd witnessed, or the disturbing intelligence the emus had displayed. Such observations would have made us all sound insane. But I couldn't let it go. Even as the official reports were filed and the embarrassing episode was buried in military archives, I found myself returning to those notes I'd made in the field, the observations I'd crossed out, the patterns I'd witnessed that shouldn't have been possible. During my off-duty hours, I began researching everything I could find about emu behavior. I visited the agricultural stations that had been reporting damage, interviewed farmers who'd been dealing with these birds for decades. Slowly, a different picture began to emerge. The emus hadn't just appeared from nowhere to plague the wheat fields. They'd been adapting to human presence for generations. As settlers had carved farms from the wilderness, the birds had learned to exploit the new opportunities. They'd discovered that cultivated crops provided more reliable nutrition than their traditional food sources. They'd observed human schedules and seasonal patterns. They'd adapted their migration routes to take advantage of agricultural cycles. An old-timer named Mackenzie, whose family had been farming near Merredin since the 1890s, told me something that made my skin crawl. "Been watching them birds change their ways for 40 years, he said, squinting out over his damaged wheat field. "My grandfather," he said, "they used to scatter at the first sight of a man. Nowadays they study you, watch how you move, where you go, what you do. Smart as any sheepdog, and getting smarter every year." Another farmer, a woman named Sarah Henderson, whose property had been hit particularly hard, described behavior that sounded remarkably similar to what we'd encountered. "They don't just eat and move on anymore, they plan it. Send scouts ahead, coordinate their movements, post sentries while the main flock feeds." She paused, watching the horizon where distant shapes moved against the golden wheat. "Last month, I swear I saw them set up what looked like a deliberate distraction, some birds making noise on one side of the property while the main group came in from the other direction. The more I learned, the more I realized that our military operation hadn't been an isolated incident. We'd walked into a conflict that had been building for decades, facing an enemy that had been studying human tactics and developing countermeasures long before we arrived on the scene. Years passed. I was transferred to other duties, other stations, other forgotten corners of the empire. The Great Emu War, as the press had dubbed it, became a source of embarrassment in official circles and comedy everywhere else. But I never forgot those intelligent eyes. That coordinated movement, the feeling of being outmaneuvered by creatures that weren't supposed to be capable of strategic thinking. In 1947, 15 years after our defeat, I returned to Western Australia on personal leave. The wheat country looked much the same, though the farms had expanded and new settlements had sprouted along the railway lines. But the emu problem persisted. If anything, it had gotten worse. At a pub in Merredin, I met a young agricultural officer who'd been assigned to study the ongoing crop damage. Over several pints, he told me something that confirmed my darkest suspicions. "The birds are definitely getting more sophisticated," he said, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "We've documented behaviors that suggest they're passing information between flocks, coordinating movements across hundreds of miles. It's like they've developed their own military intelligence network." He showed me photographs and charts that could have come from a war room. Maps marking emu movements, timelines showing coordinated attacks on multiple farms, diagrams illustrating tactical formations that looked disturbingly familiar. The evidence was undeniable. The emus had been fighting a guerrilla war against human settlement, and they were winning. "The strangest thing," the officer continued, "is that older farmers tell stories about their grandfathers dealing with these birds, and the behavior patterns are completely different. According to the historical accounts, emus used to be opportunistic feeders with basic survival instincts. What we're seeing now is systematic exploitation of human agricultural practices, with learning curves that suggest generational knowledge transfer." Generational knowledge transfer. The phrase stuck with me as I drove back to Perth, watching the endless wheat fields roll past my window. The emus hadn't just defeated us in 1932, they'd been preparing for that confrontation for decades. Every interaction with humans had been a learning opportunity. Every failed attempt to drive them off had taught them something new about human tactics and limitations. We hadn't lost to mindless animals. We'd lost to an enemy that had been studying us, adapting to our methods, developing countermeasures to our weapons and strategies. The Great Emu War hadn't been a comedy of errors. It had been the inevitable result of underestimating an adversary that had been preparing for conflict longer than we'd been aware one existed. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. If birds could develop such sophisticated responses to human pressure, what did that say about our understanding of the natural world? How many other species were adapting to human presence in ways we couldn't see or wouldn't recognize? As I watched the sun set over the wheat fields where I'd once fled in terror, I felt a profound shift in my understanding of humanity's place in the Australian landscape. We'd come to this continent as conquerors, certain of our superiority over the native species and ecosystems. But the emus had taught us a different lesson, one about adaptation, intelligence, and the dangerous folly of underestimating those we consider beneath us. The war had never really ended. It had just moved beyond the reach of military solutions, into the realm of an ongoing evolutionary arms race between human agriculture and creatures far more capable than we'd ever imagined. 30 years have passed since I first put pen to paper trying to make sense of what happened in those wheat fields outside Chandler. 30 years of watching this country change, of seeing new generations of farmers take up the same battles their grandfathers fought, of witnessing the slow recognition that perhaps we've been approaching this land all wrong from the very beginning. I'm an old man now, sitting on my veranda in Perth, watching the evening light paint the hills gold, and I find myself thinking more and more about those days when I was young enough to believe that superior firepower could solve any problem. The Lewis guns are long gone, scrapped for metal during the next war, the one where humans fought humans instead of birds. Major Meredith passed away 15 years ago, taking with him the last of the official shame about our defeat in the wheat fields. The other lads from that operation scattered across the continent, most of them carrying the story as a private joke, a tale to share over beers about the time the army couldn't handle a few oversized chickens. But I've never been able to laugh about it. Perhaps it's because I was the one tasked with documenting everything, with watching through my field glasses as seasoned soldiers discovered that their training meant nothing against an enemy that played by different rules. Perhaps it's because I was young enough then to have my worldview shattered by the realization that intelligence and adaptation weren't uniquely human traits. Or perhaps it's simply because I've lived long enough to see the same patterns repeat themselves across this continent, in contexts far removed from agricultural pest control. With every year of watching, the Emu War read less like an accident and more like a warning. It was a perfect microcosm of every interaction between European settlers and the Australian continent. We arrived with our assumptions about how nature should behave, our confidence in technological solutions, our certainty that superior organization and firepower would overcome any obstacle this land could present. The Aboriginal peoples could have told us different. They understood that surviving in Australia meant learning to work with the land's rhythms instead of imposing your own. They knew that the creatures here had been adapting and surviving for millions of years, developing strategies and behaviors that made them perfectly suited to conditions that could destroy unprepared humans in a matter of days. But we weren't interested in listening to that kind of knowledge. We were too busy building fences and importing foreign crops, and expecting the continent to reshape itself around our needs. The emus taught us the same lesson the land itself had been trying to teach us all along. Australia doesn't bend to outsiders' expectations. It tests them, challenges them, forces them to adapt or perish. The birds we fought in 1932 weren't just agricultural pests. They were representatives of an entire ecosystem that had been watching human settlement patterns, learning from our successes and failures, developing responses to our intrusions. I think about this whenever I see the latest government initiative designed to manage some aspect of the Australian environment. The rabbit-proof fences that didn't stop the rabbits, the cane toads imported to control beetles that became a plague themselves, the countless introduced species that thrived beyond all expectations, while native plants and animals disappeared from landscapes they'd occupied for millennia. Each failure follows the same pattern we established in 1932. Identify a problem, apply a technological solution, discover that the problem is more complex than anticipated. Watch the solution create new problems. Retreat in confusion while declaring partial victory. The hubris remains constant. The belief that human engineering can overcome millions of years of evolution, that superior firepower translates to superior results, that what we don't understand can't hurt us. We never seem to learn that the country itself is the ultimate arbiter of who belongs and who doesn't, and it makes its decisions based on criteria we're only beginning to comprehend. I've spent decades trying to understand what those criteria might be. Observation has taught me that successful species here, whether native or introduced, share certain characteristics. They're adaptable rather than rigid, opportunistic rather than specialized, capable of reading environmental signals we haven't learned to recognize. They don't fight the land's rhythms. They find ways to work within them. They understand that survival here requires humility, patience, and respect for forces larger than themselves. The emus embodied all of these qualities. They'd spent generations learning to read human behavior, adapting their feeding patterns to take advantage of agricultural developments, developing social structures that could respond quickly to changing threats. When we arrived with our Lewis guns and our military confidence, we weren't facing simple-minded birds. We were facing creatures that understood their environment better than we understood ours, that possessed collective intelligence we'd never bothered to recognize, that had already developed effective countermeasures to every strategy we thought we were inventing. Our defeat was inevitable not because we lacked firepower, but because we lacked understanding. We approached the conflict as conquerors rather than students, as invaders rather than potential participants in an established ecosystem. We assumed that human intelligence was categorically different from, and superior to any intelligence we might encounter in the natural world. The emus proved us wrong on every count. The lesson extends far beyond wildlife management. Every aspect of human settlement in Australia has been shaped by this same fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to belong to this continent, rather than simply occupying it. Our cities sprawl across landscapes that were never designed to support dense human populations, requiring massive inputs of resources and energy to maintain conditions that approximate European comfort levels. Our agriculture depends on irrigation systems that drain rivers and aquifers faster than nature can replenish them, creating temporary abundance while building toward long-term collapse. Our mining operations extract wealth from the ground, while leaving behind contamination that will outlast human civilization itself. Our transportation networks slice through migration routes and breeding grounds that animals have used for millions of years, creating barriers that fragment ecosystems in ways we're only beginning to understand. Each of these activities follows the same pattern established in 1932: impose human will on natural systems, ignore feedback indicating that the approach is unsustainable, blame external factors when the system begins to fail. But I've also seen signs of change, particularly among younger generations who've grown up with a different relationship to the land. They approach the Australian environment with curiosity, rather than conquering ambition, seeking to understand natural processes before attempting to modify them. They recognize that indigenous knowledge systems contain information accumulated over tens of thousands of years of successful adaptation to continental conditions. They understand that true security comes not from imposing control over natural systems, but from finding sustainable ways to participate in them. These younger Australians give me hope that we might finally be learning the lessons the emus tried to teach us in 1932. They're beginning to approach the land with the humility and respect required for long-term survival here. They recognize that intelligence takes many forms, that adaptation requires flexibility rather than rigid adherence to imported assumptions, that success in Australia means learning to read the continent's signals rather than expecting it to accommodate our preferences. The Great Emu War represents everything we need to understand about our relationship with this country. We can approach Australia as conquerors, armed with superior technology and absolute confidence in our methods, and discover that the land has its own ways of determining who belongs and who doesn't. Or we can approach it as students, willing to learn from millions of years of evolutionary adaptation, ready to modify our assumptions when experience proves them inadequate. The choice determines not just our success or failure in specific endeavors, but our long-term viability as Australians. This continent has tested countless species over geological time, and the survivors are those that learn to work with its conditions, rather than against them. The emus understood this. The Aboriginal peoples understood this. We're still learning. As I watch the evening light fade behind the hills, I think about those young soldiers who retreated in confusion from the wheat fields 70 years ago, trying to understand how they'd been outmaneuvered by birds. Most of them probably went to their graves, thinking of it as an embarrassing failure, an absurd chapter in military history that was best forgotten. But I've come to see it as something much more significant, a perfect illustration of what happens when human arrogance encounters Australian reality. The emus weren't our enemies. They were our teachers. They demonstrated principles we needed to understand if we were going to succeed as Australians, rather than just Europeans temporarily displaced to the southern hemisphere. They showed us that intelligence and adaptation aren't uniquely human characteristics, that successful survival strategies often look different from what we expect, that respect for this country's creatures and conditions isn't just an ethical choice, it's a practical necessity. We lost the Great Emu War because we deserved to lose it. We approached the conflict with all the wrong assumptions, all the wrong strategies, all the wrong attitudes. The birds defeated us because they understood their country better than we understood ours. The shame isn't in losing to emus. The shame is in taking 70 years to understand why we lost and what the defeat was supposed to teach us. Australia demands humility from everyone who wants to call it home. The emus tried to teach us that lesson in 1932, and we're still learning to listen. But perhaps that's progress enough, recognizing that we have something to learn from every creature that's managed to thrive in this ancient, challenging, magnificent land. The war may have ended in defeat, but the education continues, and maybe that's exactly as it should be. The continent is still teaching. We're finally beginning to learn. If you've ever underestimated something you thought you understood completely, you know how humbling that moment of recognition can be. Hit like and subscribe. More stories from the outback are coming.